Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us this morning at this event from the National Centre for Writing. I'm Holly Ainley, Head of Programmes and Creative Engagement here at NCW, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so as we discuss the life cycle of a translation. Figures show that between 2021 and 2022, here in the UK, fiction in translation, and by that I mean stories that were originally written in a language other than English, made up 11.4% of total fiction revenue. That's £51.4 million worth of translated fiction sold. But how did those books make the journey from one language to another? Who decides which global stories are made available to UK readers in this way, and who makes it happen? Where do translators and the original authors themselves fit into this process? Having access to stories from a multitude of voices, cultures, and perspectives is hugely important, perhaps now more than ever, for helping us as readers to learn, to share, broaden our horizons, and break down barriers. We all know that literature has the power to do this. And today, we'll explore the people and the pathways that make it possible in today's publishing industry. With me to do this are three experts in this world. Laia Jufresa is a Mexican author based in Scotland. Her first novel, Umami, has been translated into 9 languages and won a Pen Translate Award and a Best First Novel Award in France. Her work has been featured in Vogue, Words Without Borders, El País, and McSweeney's. She has written for Netflix and the BBC and produced picture books for children. Jufresa has been named as one of the most outstanding young writers of Mexico and of Latin America. Louisa Pritchard runs Louisa Pritchard Associates, LPA, an agency which specialises in selling international rights on behalf of literary agencies and publishers. She has more than 25 years of experience in selling rights to a wide range of fiction and non-fiction. Prior to founding LPA, she worked as head of rights at the literary agency PFD, foreign rights director at Orion Publishing, and senior rights manager at Random House. Daniela Schlingmann is the director of Daniela Schlingmann Literary Scouting Limited, an international scouting agency based in London. Daniela started her publishing career at an independent publisher in Frankfurt, Germany. She moved on to join Random House in Munich, commissioning German authors as well as writers from the UK, the US, and specialising in fiction from Nordic countries. In 2005, Daniela relocated to London and founded her scouting agency. So, welcome everyone. Really great to have you here today and to be having this conversation. I want to take us right to the start of the whole publishing process, which of course begins with the author and their manuscript. So Laia, I wondered if we could start with you and ask, before you even began to think about your work being translated, can you briefly tell us what your experience of finding a publisher for your debut novel, Umami, was like?
Hello. Thank you everyone for listening to this, and thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be part of this. Before I even answer your question, I'm just going to say that, listening to you, what really comes to my mind. Well, first of all, unlike the others, I'm not an expert on the industry. I'm only an expert on my own experience. And an interesting part of that is that I come from a different culture and that I grew up reading in Spanish and in French because I grew up in Mexico and in France. And these are languages that have around 40% of everything that gets published is coming from translation, as opposed to 3% in English. That's a very famous number. So I just thought I'd throw in that in there because all the work all of you are doing to bring foreign literature to be translated in English is really important because that number is absurdly low and there's a lot of richness out there that the English-speaking readers don't have access. I definitely was not thinking about getting translated when I finished my first novel. I think only because getting that novel published is already very daunting. But it happened not only in a parallel track, it happened even before. My novel sold in French before it sold in Spanish. So I think eventually in this conversation, the place of an agent who sells the rights to that, of course, will come in. But the way it happened for me was that I finished this novel, I found this agent, and all I thought was like, well, someone published it in Spanish. And then he called and said, I sold it in French first than anything. And for me, it was exciting because I didn't expect it, but I grew up reading in French, so it felt very exciting to me to be published in French. So I don't think that's the normal case. The normal case is, of course, the book gets published in the language it was written, and then the translations come, which still happened with my book. It's just that the rights sold first.
It's fascinating. So it sounds like having a literary agent was really key to that process, though, for you.
Yeah, I think which I had to learn because unlike in English, in Spanish, it's fairly new to that everyone has an agent. Not everyone even has an agent. But even 10 years ago when I was doing this, it was rare to have an agent. But it was incredibly helpful, and I don't think my novel would have gotten as many. I mean, I'm pretty sure it would have not gotten the translations without the agent's work. Agents operate in that world of being the world right, whereas one normally operates in a much smaller sphere.
Yeah, and I guess the authors in the audience will probably be interested to know whether you found that agent first time or whether you submitted to lots of different people.
I didn't find an agent. The agent found me, but again, that speaks more of the culture I come from because it wasn't a thing you did go looking for an agent with your first book. I think more and more it is now, and it was definitely something I knew I had to do, but he reached out to me before the novel was finished. All of you that are working on a first book know it's very nerve-wracking to actually say you're doing but I made myself put at the end, I published a story in a magazine, and I made myself put in the bio, she's finished her first novel. And I guess and I did it only to conquer the fear, but it was really a very lucky battle to the sea, because my first agent, that's the way he found me. I am no longer with him because now I'm writing in English, and so I've switched to an agent in English.
It's a really varied experience. Daniela, I'm thinking you're now a scout, of course, and we'll talk about that really soon, but perhaps you have an insight into what it's like to be on the other side of the kind of acquisitions process, as you were an editor before, commissioning. And I just wonder, when you're in that process of acquiring a manuscript, how do you decide, and does the potential for the book to succeed in translation, is that in your mind at that point, or are you just thinking about your own kind of the country you're publishing into?
That's quite an interesting question, and taps a little bit into my editorial past. Yes. So I think as an editor, when you're in that process, you really think about your own market first, and you think, will this book work in? And of course, I was then back in Germany, so I would have considered, will this book work in the German market? Now being based in London, I would then think, will British readers want to read that? Translation comes a little bit later. In the UK, probably that's more significant than in any other language, because English language books are being translated everywhere in the rest of the world. And of course, we know here in the UK, other language books don't come to us. I mean, like you just said, there's a limitation to what English language readers can actually access because it's not there, which is, I think we probably all agree on that, frustrating. But no, when you're an editor, you have a passion for a project, and you think you love it yourself, and you think there will be other people who love this book, and therefore you want to get it through all those meetings. And that's probably, Holly, that must have been your experience as well back in your past. You love it. It's like you carry that project forward, and then you think about how will it work in that entity I work in, rather than just going broad at that point.
Yeah, I agree. Yes, I should also say that I previously worked as a commissioning editor for a UK publishing house. So yeah, I think you you are first and foremost thinking of your kind of home audience. But it's interesting because I think more and more, as you say, it's a consideration as when you're commissioning into the UK of how might this sit for a global audience or in other territories. Once a book's acquired in its original language, obviously the work begins between an editor and the author. But Louisa, you've worked in-house for some major UK publishers. So where does and when does the foreign rights team come in? What's the role of a foreign rights team?
Well, if you're working in-house for a publisher, often quite early, there are some books where you get involved in the acquisition process, particularly if it's a book where, an editor is potentially having to find a lot of money to bid for it. They will come to the rights department often at an early stage and ask your opinion on, well, do you think this will travel? Who do you think might buy it? And invite you to actually sort of put money into the pot that they're using to acquire the book. So that does happen sometimes, and that can be it's exciting to be involved and actually be part of the acquisition. Other projects, it is a little bit further down the line. Some books are acquired very much on the passion of the acquiring editor. And when I'm selling rights, that's one of the things I'm always looking for, actually, is to sort of feel the enthusiasm of the editor project. So yeah, sometimes it's a little bit further down the line, but yeah, sometimes you're involved, at the point where, an editor will come to you and say, I've read this, I think it's brilliant, I really want to buy it. Can you help me find the money to offer to the agent?
How do you know whether to support that book or not? If an editor comes to you and says, do you think this will do well outside of the UK? I mean, it's a question I'll ask Daniela later as well, but how do you know?
It's sometimes it feels, sometimes it does feel you are having to, give it your best shot, basically. But it comes, I guess, it's an informed gamble, because I spend my time talking to to editors overseas, and you read a lot. I mean, a lot of it comes, from I guess from knowing the markets. I spend sort of several weeks a year traveling, and then there are major book fairs, particularly in London in the spring and in Frankfurt in the autumn. And the whole rights industry, we all go and talk to each other sort of in kind of a series of meetings that take place we work on 30-minute meetings from 9 in the morning until 6 at night, and it's kind of like sort of speed dating for agents and editors. But those sorts of conversations sort of inform your decision. But it's also, you have a feel for a book, and you think, yes, I know. And sometimes it's as specific as you think, I know this editor in a particular market will love it. Or you just feel that from looking at a particular market, that you think that this will be a book that will appeal to readers in a particular part of the world.
Yeah, great. And then just digging a little bit deeper. So you have a sense that this is going to work. You then the notion of selling foreign rights, I imagine, feels a bit kind of intangible to people because you're selling something you can't hold in your hands, really. So how does that work? You're kind of how do people put a price on these things? Other countries, I mean.
In some ways, what I'm doing is similar actually to what an agent in the UK is doing, in that I'm reading a book, and there's an element of matchmaking about it. You read a book and you find that you're looking for the right editor at different markets for it. So it's connecting a book with the right person at the other end who will have that sort of same passion to publish it in a different market. And we'll have, the conversations you have are the same as you have kind of when deciding to publish in the UK about how it will be positioned and promoted. And I stay in touch, and you're involved throughout the publication process.
So, Daniela, you're a literary scout, which I think is a term and a job that still seems to be very shrouded in an amount of mystery. for those of us outside, well, those watching outside of the publishing industry. So I wonder if you can describe what you do and where you come into this process. And I guess I'm also interested in how closely you'd work with someone like in Louisa's position.
Yeah, thank you. I'm absolutely happy to explain the mystery to a certain extent. Of course, we're shrouded in mystery, and to a certain degree, we want that because we cannot always talk with absolute openness about everything that's sort of going on behind the scenes. We're very much behind the scenes. We're matchmakers. I think it's quite interesting that so many of us worldwide come from maybe a different country than the one we live in. So there's a lot of internationality about us, and that I find very, very fascinating. We build cultural bridges. We help sort of with cultural transformation in a certain way. So I ran an office out of London with a team of 12 scouts and associates and assistants. And we read a lot. So we see manuscripts ahead of publication. And we're being asked by publishing houses globally who we work with in sort of exclusive relationships. We're being asked by them to assess that material and sort of help them filter a little bit. There's so much manuscripts out from literary agents who are seeking to sell those books to publishing houses all over the world and into translation all over the world. And we read those manuscripts quite early on and then try to add our voice to the mix. And I really think we add something. We don't ever take anything away. We're not absolutely determining a process, but we give thoughts to what we think about books and how they might work in other countries. So you might have a literary agent in the UK trying to sell a book to a UK publishing house, but they have a foreign rights team with somebody like Louisa trying to sell those rights further on to sort of get more revenue in and be able to bolster that author a bit better in their publishing house. So they come to us and ask us, do you think your German publishing house, do you think your Brazilian publishing house, your Spanish publishing house, your Norwegian publishing house might be interested in publishing this novel or this non-fiction book or this children's book? We work in all of those areas. And then we have to think about it. So, of course, you think about the quality of the text, and of course, you bring your own taste to it too. But you also have to step away from that and think, okay, so what is my knowledge of Spain? We do work with Planeta, so we do actually work with Planeta Mexico as well. So I'm trying to understand from my position here in the UK, what would potentially work in Mexico? And then what would work in Norway? We have a publisher in Hungary. We do work with a publisher in China still, which is, of course, a very complex situation at the moment. So you have to think about what might those countries like. I come from Germany initially, so I can always put my German hat on again and go like, oh, let's say it's a celebrity memoir. That's very simple. That person isn't known in Germany, so therefore this memoir will actually not resonate in that market. That's a simple one. But you can take that onto onto novels, and you can see how much are they sort of woven into the fabric of British culture, regional cultures like Scottish or Irish or Cornish, and can see, is there something there that people in other countries would like to know about this story? Is there something that will resonate? Or is it something that doesn't translate or travel? Somebody brought that up before. Does this book travel or not? So that's where we're sort of in that process. And we give assessments on what we think about it. Will this work or not? And give recommendations, and that's sort of my long sort of curve back to the question. We give recommendations to publishing houses we work for exclusively, whether or not a book would work in their market. And then, of course, we connect to literary agents. So, Louisa, you were working in publishing houses. You're now specialized on translation rights. So I would then talk to you about our clients. You would send me maybe a manuscript, and I would see, is that for any of our publishers? So we as Scouts work really closely with all literary agents, and we work very closely with global publishing houses to sort of facilitate that progress and that process between getting a bit from one culture to the other. And we can accelerate things a little bit if they're very exciting. and help match make books with people and people with people. Personal relationships are very important too.
So essentially, scouts are an all-seeing eye through the industry. I love that idea of cultural translation as well. And Laia, I'm just wondering, listening to all of this, how that feels to know that as an author, all this discussion and all these people are reading your book, and it must be strange to think that this is happening in lots of different territories. And what's that experience like?
I mean, I was also positioning myself, trying to think what the listeners may be feeling. And I think it's likely that a lot of you are feeling like this is a world that's not attainable and it's behind some kind of gates. Because when you're first starting out, it's very easy to imagine like these people are holding the gates closed. And I think it's always interesting, or two things that help me when I get anxious about the whole thing. One is to think of it as teamwork, which is that when you hold in your hands a published book, you're really not just holding the author's work. You have the agent, the translator, the publisher, the publicist. Like there's so many people involved. And I think that's important to remember for two reasons. One, because as an author, you're often comparing yourself with published work, because you have little access to work in process. And we all do that. My day job is to coach writers, and I spend my life reminding them and myself that that's really unfair because when you hold a book, that's a teamwork that you're judging your draft against. So I think Luis used the word that for me is the most important, which is enthusiasm. So it's not gates that the industry is holding. They are looking for work as well. And what you need to do is do your best work and find the people who are excited about it. And to the translators that are listening to this, I think you can have also a more active role. In my experience, a lot of the people that translated my first novel was their first published translation. And some of them got that themselves, like the credit is on them. They asked me if they could do a sample, and they worked with my agent and convinced the publisher. So also again, the enthusiasm and what Daniela was talking about, when you fall in love with a book as a translator, you don't have to be necessarily passive waiting for someone to call you. When you have that excitement about the book, you can try and get it. You don't always get it, but you can try.
Yeah, that's really interesting to know. And I think we should stay on that kind of how the translator becomes involved in the project. So, we've got to this point, we talked about a book being acquired by a publisher, scouts and the foreign rights, drumming up international sales. And I wonder, Louisa, in your experience, where and how and when do translators become attached to a project? And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that relationship between publishers and translators.
Yeah, it varies a little bit. In general, if I'm selling translation rights to a publisher in another country, the choice of the translator is usually actually down to the publisher. But within that, I will have the contract with the publisher will always have a clause saying that the author has the right to approve the choice of the translator and to read the translation to make sure that they're happy with it. So it's usually, the translator is usually appointed by the publisher. But we do, we talk to the translator. The translator is obviously, will talk to the author through the translation process. But there are other occasions, actually, I think Laia touched on this, where translators actually get in touch to say that they've read the English language edition of a book and they really love it, and they've got, they would love to talk to publishers that they're in touch with about it. So that does sometimes actually lead to bring results as well.
Seems to all be coming back to just falling in love with the book, really. Who has the most passion and enthusiasm?
Again, on what Laia was saying about it can, I know kind of, yes, from the outside, the industry can look very, very daunting. But yeah, the thing is, actually, it is an industry full of people who really want, we all spend our days looking for the books that we really love. And when you read something and you love it, it's an industry full of people who will, absolutely go out and fight fight for their writers.
Yeah, yeah. And I wonder, or perhaps a question for you and for Daniela, if you've ever been in a situation or heard of a situation where, a translation has happened and the author wasn't happy, or the publisher has felt that the translation hasn't done something justice, or does that kind of thing happen, or is it, is the kind of the work beforehand avoids that, the matchmaking work?
That's a really complicated one. I think it does occasionally happen. Of course, it requires the author to be able to read the translation. So, of course, you have, translations into English. That's always, we have this division a little bit, English of the rest of the world. So if you translate into English, of course, you will find most authors can actually read that. If you translate an English novel into Finnish, you're unlikely to find any author to complain about the translation because it's not accessible. I shouldn't be joking about it. But it's a question about access. I've had, this is really back in the day when I was a young editor back in Germany. I had an author, he was originally from America but had changed language. And that's quite a challenge for authors, actually, writing a language other than their birth language. And I'm sure Laia will agree to that, sort of switched over to that. So I worked with somebody who had just switched to writing in German. So it's actually not the translation, but the editor. She felt her text wasn't really sort of reflected correctly in the other language. And that became difficult. So then you had to sort of liaise and sit down together and discuss that a little bit. But I think in principle, that doesn't happen too often because, of course, translation is very much, again, cultural interpretation. You can't translate literally. All of the translators who are watching this today will know that you have to pick the voice and you have to pick the style. You have to really modulate a language to bring it into another one. You can't just go word by word, and it's an art form in itself. So therefore it needs the artistic freedom to allow for that. And there are interesting discussions in all sorts of countries about putting translators on the book cover. Some countries do it very much, others don't do it very much. There's a discussion in the UK about that. So I think there might be discussions, but the complete unhappiness and then retranslating, I think that doesn't really happen that often. That's my experience, Louisa, but you might have been.
Yeah, no, it's one of those. Yes, it doesn't happen very often. When it does, something's gone wrong because we try very hard to make sure it does. I work with a couple of writers who've had very interesting experiences. I work with because they speak the language that the book's being translated into. So I work with a Dutch writer, for instance, who now writes in English because he wanted to reach sort of a larger potential audience in the UK and the US. But then felt he didn't have the time away from his day job to translate his own book back into Dutch. And he found it a slightly unsettling experience because he said the translation was great, the translator was terrific, but it just wasn't quite him. It was sort of, it felt, there were just little choices of, it was just expressed slightly differently. He found the whole experience slightly, I think, disconcerting in some ways. But that, he acknowledged that was, a perfectly understandable sort of situation. And we just sort of sat the author and the translator down for a couple of sessions to sort of smooth things through. But I think you found it a really, interesting experience.
Yeah. And Laia, I want to bring you in because you mentioned that your first book, you wrote in Spanish, but it was published first in France, which is also a language that you know. So what that experience was like for you and how closely you worked with the translator.
I worked very closely with the translator to English, Sophie Hughes, to the point where the book is different, which was very confusing for a lot of the translators. Well, not confusing because we explained, but there are entire passages in Umami in English that I wrote for the English version. I always say about Sophie that she's the only friend I've ever made through color-coded notes on a Word document. So we started to know each other when she was translating the book, but we really hit on really good creative process together. And I just wrote a short story a few months ago, and she translated it, and we hadn't worked together for years because I've been writing in English, and it was just an incredible experience. I mean, a translator is the person that will read your work the closest. So it's always such a eye-opening experience to have someone that takes the time like that with your work. I mean, it's like a fantasy when you write that everyone will pay that close attention, and no one really does. But a translator has to. I think a translator is the writer. And, you know, when Daniela says it's an art form, I think if you're starting out as a translator, it's a really good idea to own the fact that you're a writer. You're a very peculiar kind of writer, but your material is still language, and you still have all these things that you need to come across from the original, but knowing that your version will never be the same as someone else. So I mean, that's why translation slams exist, right? When you have two translators translating the same passage on stage, and it's incredibly different what they will do, and there's no right or wrong. So in that sense, I think it's an art form. And just to finish this, I would say that to the question, have you ever known someone who's very unhappy with the translation? I do know a lot of instances where mistakes are made, and this happens a lot in Spanish because Spanish is not one language, it's many languages. I mean, the second most spoken language in the world. So it's also a good idea if you're starting out as a translator from Spanish to specialize in a region, or to be really humble and aware that words mean different things in different countries. Just to give you a quick example, I have a friend whose novel starts in the shower, and the translation to French, instead of douche, which is the shower, says arrosoir, which is a watering can for plants. And that's the first paragraph of a novel. And suddenly the novel is like science fiction because someone is inside a water can. So yeah, so specializing in a region is a good idea.
Well, I think nuance doesn't quite do it, does it? It's more than that. I'm conscious about getting to the kind of life cycle of the translation, but I also think I just want to pick up on the fact that I think you've all perhaps mentioned that difference between the process of translating out of and into English, and which is more common, and the way that the UK publishing industry is perhaps a little bit different, and what that means for authors and translators. And I just picked out a quote from an article in The Bookseller, which is the publishing industry's trade magazine. And it was from an article last year which said the UK proportionally publishes less translated literature than most European countries, and consequently, the readership and sales lag behind our neighbours. Now, we know also that the market share of books being translated into English is growing, but I wonder, perhaps Daniela, if I start with you, from your experience, why do you think the UK has been slower on the uptake and less receptive to translation? Is it because readers don't have the appetite, or is it a communication issue, or?
I think it's a communication issue. I think that's probably the best way to... I'm always baffled by that again, but I think that's probably what it is. I think there is something very particular about, of course, the status of the English language, and to a certain extent also then the Spanish language in the world, because so many people speak those two languages. So there is more of an expectation. You don't need to speak that many other languages. So there, because you can be understood wherever you go. And that puts an artificial barrier up to some extent, I think, between your culture and the other ones. Now, just to go back to English, because I have more expertise there, I think there's also been a tradition a little bit to label translated fiction. I think that's probably more true, to label it translated fiction by all means as literary fiction, whatever it is, and whether they are crime novels or whether it's something really accessible. But there has been this perception in the market that this would be something really challenging to read. And of course that then means readers of just good stories who want to pop to Tesco's and buy their groceries and get a really good read wouldn't have picked those books up. And I think that's been a barrier that's now being slowly chipped at and broken away. And we've learned within the industry that translated fiction and also translated nonfiction can become massive bestsellers and can be big stories that people really engage with. But that's quite a recent development. I've been doing this job for the last 17 years, and I think initially there were like 5 books in German every year translated into English. I think that's certainly doubled now, but also other languages have opened up the market a bit. And for me, it's really how publishers initially placed and positioned those books, making it harder for readers who just want to read a good story, and there's nothing wrong with that. We all love literary fiction. Working in the industry, that's often the case, but it doesn't mean we don't want to be entertained and thrilled by terrified by a horror novel, but any kind of those stories that come from all over the world, they just need to be presented differently. And one last thing to throw in the mix, I find it super interesting that Netflix is now available, that's just one of those platforms, available in different languages, so people can switch around and can also see narratives and stories coming from all sorts of cultures and countries in their own platform, easily accessible, very easy to consume. And I think that's broken down one of those barriers I'm just talking about. But I don't know what others think about that.
Louisa.
Yeah, I agree absolutely with what you say about traditionally translated literature having been sort of somehow other. And therefore sort of more literary and rather than just being, a really good read. I think that has changed. I think there's something interesting. I think sort of Nordic crime did something very interesting, because not only did that sort of break through as sort of something that, people just buy because it's a terrific read, but actually it became a selling point in its own right. That kind of Nordic crime became something that people would seek out, and that felt like an advance really for translated literature in this country. But there's a long way to go, we're getting better. Yes, long may that continue.
I'm just wondering, for both of you actually, whether you find that when you're having conversations with both your overseas clients and your UK contacts, whether there's a kind of fluidity to those. I mean, obviously you are trying this, your job is about exporting, but is there also that kind of exchange of, oh, well, actually my client is publishing something really interesting in a different language, you might like to consider it for the UK?
Well, from my perspective, certainly, yes, absolutely. I talk to a lot of editors in the UK about what they're reading and what they're liking. And more there's an opening, and there are specific editors and publishing houses who are open-minded and have expertise, or have readers. That's probably something where the translators come in and have readers in foreign languages. They're happy to look at those books and consider them. So a tip-off from a scout is really helpful. And you do sort of say, oh yeah, have you heard of this crime novel? I mean, Nordic crime is a really good example. And then you're like, I represent 15 publishers internationally who've bought this Swedish crime novel. Why don't you take a look at it? And then it might work in the UK as well. And then, of course, readers or sample translations come into play there. So if such one is available in English, so if that Nordic crime novel had 50 pages in English, there's a higher chance that this book will travel. And that an editor who might not be able to read Swedish can still get it through acquisitions, or can commission more to have more of the text available so that this book will eventually make its way into the UK market. Absolutely. So it's a mix of availability and recommendation. I think that's how we all operate very much in the industry.
I can say I had an interesting experience. I work with an agent who is based in Germany, actually. And he has on several occasions been approached by authors either in Germany or in other markets with a view to helping them place their books into the UK. A little while ago, actually, we worked with a Korean popular science writer. And so the agent I worked with was then able to sell that book in the UK and the US. And then actually having an English translation Korean book was really powerful, because then we were able to take that English translation and sell the project into 7 or 8 further languages.
That is, yeah, it's interesting because it's still kind of, as Daniela was saying, puts the power on the English as a language version. But
yes, I mean, there's sort of there are sort of I think the number of kind of sort of Korean, Swedish translators is sort of relatively is perhaps more limited. So in those situations, kind of an English translation can be a very helpful bridge to help editors in other markets read the book.
Absolutely. And Laia, the book you're next publishing or you're writing, I'm not sure what stage it's at, is in English. And I'm just wondering how you're now feeling about this almost being the reverse process.
Yeah, it's very strange. But I just want to add an anecdote what they were saying, because
Please.
My agent, Laurence Lalliouche is her name, she did this. Like she was selling foreign rights for many years, but she kept finding these amazing authors all over the world that were not translated into English. And she started bringing them and building her own list. And now she stopped selling rights because now she has a very big list. And in doing so, I feel like she's given a very big gift to the English language, because she's brought a lot of the last Nobel Prize, Olga Torkas, like people who were not available in English. So I think not only this does happen, the recommendation of agents and scouts telling UK, hey, there's these amazing people, but I think it's also growing a lot, and that this is what's changing the panorama, I think. I'm so sorry. It's kind of nerve-wracking, actually. It's very, I mean, I'm not at the stage, I don't know who will translate it yet. It has been sold in Spanish, so I know it will get published, but I don't know who will translate it. And it is very nerve-wracking, because I know how important it is to respect the translator's work, and also how little time I will have to even make annotations, probably. So it's not I would like someone to do a first draft and then give me the Spanish version and then let me do my thing. That would be my ideal, but that would be not very cool to the translators. So I think it's just going to be a matter of letting go and giving input when it really is helpful. But I'm not there yet. I haven't properly, it hasn't sold in English. It hasn't been submitted in English because it's too long. And I'm cutting it.
Watch this space. Watch this space. So I think we can't have a discussion about translation of selling foreign rights without, as Louisa brought up back at the beginning, talking about international book fairs. And as Louisa mentioned, there's Frankfurt Book Fair in the autumn, there's London Book Fair in the spring. Of course, there are others, including Bologna Book Fair in the spring, which focus entirely on children's books. So I wonder if you can just explain, in a nutshell, anyone, what is a book fair? What happens at a book fair? What do you do there?
I mean, they're fascinating. They're really highlights for the people in the publishing industry. I think there are two types. There are actually book fairs which bring readers and the general public in as well. Frankfurt Book Fair is one of those, where you have a sort of area for professional people in the publishing industry, but you also give the general readers access, and there's a platform where they can meet their heroes, they can meet authors. They do get to meet translators too, who might sometimes be invited to help with a certain author. So that's all there. The London Book Fair is more within the industry, and that's really just mostly trade only. Bologna has illustrators, young illustrators, coming showing their work. So again, that's very open. They are matchmaking places. It's just a bit like a giant pool of speed dating. We are all trying to meet people who are like-minded, who have something interesting to tell us, and we talk about books without many of them sometimes being visible. There's an area where, I should hand over to you then, Louisa, where we all sit, like the agents and the scouts and the rights people in the publishing houses with little tables. And then we stand up every 30 minutes, go to the next one, sit down again to talk about books and swap ideas. And maybe you can pick up, Louisa, and explain a bit, well, what do we actually do there?
Yeah, someone who came to a fair once memorably described the agent centre as looking like a cross between a prison visiting centre and your sort of A-level exam hall. It's rows and rows of desks, and people talking earnestly for hours on end. So generally, sort of my day at a fair will be booked sort of solid from 9 in the morning till 6 in the evening on 30-minute slots. And there's a lot of work goes into planning that. The London Book Fair is in late April, but my diary is already filling up for that. And it's sort of you fill your diary with both to keep up with people you've known for a long time, and to sort of introduce new projects to them, but also trying to make sure that you are constantly making new contacts. It's an exchange of gossip. It's a way of getting because you can see, in the course of a few days at a fair, you might see people from 20 different countries. So you can get a very broad overview of where the market is, which books you think are going to be particularly well received. It is sort of speed dating for good and ill. As I say, you can get a very broad overview, and that's great, and you can renew contacts. But
just
for more
to be clear, the people that you're speed dating with, they are editors, they are agents.
Yes, sorry. Yes, in my case, they're editors from publishers all around the world. So yeah,
Kind of a making between, in essence, the buyers and the sellers. You have agents who have material manuscripts to sell, and then you have all the editors come in who are looking for new things that they might fall in love with and that they want to acquire. And so that's sort of, those are the meetings. And then I think we scouts come in between. We try to get the best people together to facilitate those and go, oh, you have this amazing book you just told me about. I have this editor over there. Why don't I get you together to talk about, again, this story?
I just want to say, because as an author, I find fairs incredibly overwhelming. I really don't feel comfortable. I've been to the one in Guadalajara, the one in London, and I've also been to Bologna as an illustrator. And so I just want to say to people listening, like, this is, if you love them, then of course, but this is why you want a team as well. This is why you want to trust your agent and the scouts to do their job, to find someone that's going to support. Also because as authors, one day you feel your work is amazing and the next day, not really. So you can't be trusted to be your own cheerleader. But yeah, just for anyone that's listening and feeling like, oh, 30 minutes, how are they going to just let them do their thing? And you don't necessarily have to partake of that as an author.
I live with a writer, and yes, he came to one fair and found the experience unnerving. But the other thing I would say about book fairs that they're wonderful for is that they bring editors and agents from around the world together. And so, although I go and visit editors in their own offices, in between fairs, the one thing you don't get anywhere else is you'll go out for dinner in the evening and talk to someone from France, from Germany, from the Netherlands, from Spain, all at once, and that exchange of ideas. And you will have, I might talk to a German editor about a book in the morning, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a Norwegian editor will come by and say that they'd heard about your book heard about a book you're representing from the German editor. And those sorts of networks happen at fairs. And again, it all comes back to kind of enthusiasm between people and the connections about people recommending good books to each other.
Would you be willing to share, maybe Daniela and Louisa, any really exciting moments or deals that you can remember? Maybe there were successes, maybe there were near misses, because it can be really exciting, can't it?
It can be. No, I mean, there are situations where somebody falls in love with a book at a book fair. Of course, now in the modern day, it's very easy to pass on a manuscript from one person to another because they are usually written as a Word document, and you'd send it to somebody. At that moment when an editor has read something overnight and the next morning comes to maybe our table or sees me and says, well, I've read this book, I'm going to try and acquire it at the fair. Do you know where this agent is? And that happens. So that's one of the most fascinating things that then gets talked about, and then more. I mean, that's the experience, Louisa, you just described, and more people come and say, "We heard about this. This sounds so great. Can we please have it?" So you have those sparky moments. Probably we had quite a few, of course, throughout all of those years. As a young editor, I was also in that situation, being able to acquire something at a fair, and that felt absolutely exhilarating. And that energy you then carry on with that book once you get to publication, because you had this wonderful moment when it was finally something that was in your hands.
I should say for all the translators watching that there will be an oasis for you at London Book Fair of the Literary Translation Centre, with a series of talks that go on all day, and National Centre for Writing are there, and lots of other partners. So if you are there and feeling overwhelmed by the sheer size of the industry, then come and find us there. Well, where we haven't got much time left, and I just wanted to kind of bring this full circle, or through the life cycle. So we talked about kind of how a book reaches a publishing house, how it then goes through the translation process. Then you get to the point where it's done. It's available in a new country, a new territory. Let's talk about what happens then, and that relationship with the reader, I think, which is quite interesting. Laia, I wonder just if I could start with you on this. Just what's it like knowing that people are reading a translation? Have you had different receptions in different markets?
Yes, I mean it's very surprising. My book is read mostly in Italy. It's very big in Italy. They keep reprinting it. And so I've been there and meet a lot of readers, and also they're Italian, so they make you feel loved and they feed you. And but then there are other translations, like the Polish translation, the Turkish, the Chinese, where I have no idea, to just have no idea what happened. Like, did someone read it? Often in languages where you can't even find out by Googling yourself because it's a different alphabet. So I think there's also this sense that becomes very real once you start the publishing period, but especially in translation, that a book has their own life, that you can no longer, I mean, that's true for publishing in your language, but in translation, it's even further away. So you not only can you not control it, but often you have no idea what's happening. But when you do get a chance to meet readers, it's very exciting. And I think the sense of having written something that does travel and that does feel universal enough, it's a very good feeling as a writer. And I think everything we're talking about today is the belief that literature can be universal and can travel, and that it's exciting as a reader to have access to different cultures and languages. So having, been able to send your work out in the unknown to a language you don't even speak, it's very, very rewarding.
Thank you. And just really, really briefly, because I know, just thinking back, Daniela, when you were talking about that kind of attitude previously to translated fiction being siloed in some ways because it felt like it was one thing. Quick question about bookshops and translated fiction, and whether is there a benefit to having a translated fiction section? I mean, in some ways, it's great to draw attention to fresh voices, but does that do it a disservice? It's all great stories.
I mean, my personal view is it would do it a disservice, but it's really interesting how different countries approach it differently. In France, you also have this division and section in every bookshop for the foreign books, and then you have the French books. But that seems to work. France is very open to translated works. Coming from Germany, where that's completely mixed, I think personally, if you're a reader, you want to pick up a story, and it doesn't really matter where it comes from. You might want to do that journey a little bit, like into the north of Sweden, into the depth of Mexico, into China, and the sci-fi world there. So that can be flagged up in a certain way, but at the end of the day, they're all stories, and they're just different voices from all over the world, and we are readers in principle are open to that. So if I personally feel the more you label it, the more you put it in a corner, and you sort of almost encourage people not to buy those books. And they should just be with everything else because they're stories. But that's absolutely to be disagreed with if others don't feel like that.
Louisa, the last word.
No, I think I agree with Daniela on that. But I think, as you say, that's partly to do with the culture, perhaps of translated literature in the UK in particular, sort of previously having been seen as a bit difficult. But I would agree that yes, what we want to see is translated literature being seen as great stories, and I agree absolutely that the great joy of our job is bringing great stories from wherever they come from in the world to readers wherever they want to read them.
Thank you so much, Laia, Daniela, Louisa, for this brilliant conversation today. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have too, and hope that we've managed to demystify the process of the life cycle of the translation in our publishing industry, even just a little bit for writers and translators and for readers watching. I hope we have managed to delve into areas that have felt useful and perhaps even inspiring for your next move. As we've mentioned through the discussion, translated fiction in the UK market is on the rise, and that can only mean more opportunities for all of us. Thanks for watching. Take care.